Hi my dears, welcome to my next class of Egyptian technique, and today it's a very important lesson and very useful for you because I'm going to explain the mistakes in almost all of the hip movements which we have learned in my previous classes. The screen will be divided into two parts, and on the first part you will see the correct type of the movement which I have been explaining in my videos, and on this part of the screen you will see the type of the movement with mistakes and details which are wrong. And before each mistake I'm going to tell you what is wrong in this type of movement. The first hip technique which we are going to take is going to be our movement, the cat, and I will show you many varieties of mistakes which people can make while doing this hip technique. In the first mistake, please pay your attention to my leg, which is moving late in comparison with the correct movement. The next mistake which you have to pay attention to is the position of my hips. The next mistake which you have to pay attention to, it's about my hip movement, and some people are doing shimmy or unclear hip movements instead of two hip drops down. The next mistake, it's when people are not working with their hip and leg at the same time like a gyr, but they are late with putting their foot down on the floor. The next mistake is when people fall down on their foot too obviously instead of the stable movement. The next mistake is when people are pushing their hip too much to the side instead of putting it down. The next mistake is when people do twist with their hip instead of putting their hip up. Next hip technique is Hagala step number 2, and the mistake is when people are missing their hip push to the front. The next mistake in Hagala step is when people put their foot down on the floor from their toe to their heel instead of immediately putting their foot down on their heel. The next mistake is when people totally don't twist their hip in Hagala step. The next mistake is when people are doing unclear hip movements with shimmy instead of making very clear hip movements in Hagala step. The next mistake is when people push their hip too much back. The next mistake is when people confuse the step Hagala number 1 with Hagala number 2. The next hip technique is the hip down with traveling. The first mistake is when people are moving their hips not from the down of their belly, but they are working with the waist or from the chest. The next mistake is when people are falling too much down to their foot in the back. The next mistake is when people are not contracting their muscles to make clear hip movements and they are making soft and unclear ones instead. The next mistake is when people are confusing this hip movement down with the hip to the side. The next mistake is when people are putting their front leg too much up. The next mistake is when people are trying to do this movement with their bent knees and sitting down. We continue, and the next mistake which people are making is when they are trying to do this movement with totally straight legs. The next mistake is when people are lifting too much their leg in the back. We continue and we go on to the next hip technique, and it's going to be jewel. The first mistake is when people are trying to do jewel with totally straight legs. The next mistake is when people are not working with their right and left joint separately, but they are moving both of their hips simultaneously. We continue, and the next mistake is when people are trying to push their feet too much front and up. The next very important mistake is when people are not doing the vertical hip circle. And the next mistake is when people are not putting the twist in their hips while making the jewel. Guys, we continue and we go on to the modern Egyptian Suherzaki movement. The first mistake is when people are falling too much down on their foot. The next mistake is when people are not contracting their muscles in the hips and are not pushing their knee back to make a very clear accented hip movement. And the next mistake, when people are contracting their muscle and when they are pushing their knee back, but they are lifting the opposite hip up with accent instead of pushing the correct hip down with accent. And the next mistake, when people are confusing the classical Suherzaki movement with the modern Egyptian Suherzaki movement. Okay guys, we go on and we continue with the vertical hip circle just with one hip. And the first mistake will be when people are trying to do this movement with straight legs. The next mistake is when people are not pushing with their knee and they are not helping with their knee to move the joint and to make a clear hip movement. The next mistake is when people are working with both of their hips instead of working just with one hip and one joint. And the last mistake in this movement is when people are not twisting their hip to make a clear hip movement with one joint. The next movement, which we are going to talk about, is the hip accent up with muscle contraction. And the first mistake is when people are not working from the down of their belly, but they are working from the waist or from the chest instead. The next mistake in this movement is when people are not helping with their knees and their knees are completely straight. The next mistake, and it's a very important and significant one, is when people are not contracting their hip muscles to make a clear hip movement. The next mistake is when people are lifting their heels up and they are pushing their hips too much in the front. And the last mistake here is when people are sitting too much down, bending their knees. Guys, we proceed and we go on with the next hip movement, which is Egyptian shimmy with traveling around the circle. And the first mistake in this movement is when people are trying to do this movement with straight legs. And the next mistake is when people are trying to contract their muscles above their knees in making this shimmy. The next mistake is when people are contracting their muscles in the hips. We continue, and the next mistake is when people are not working with their hip bones inside, relaxed up and down, and instead they are making just one line in their hips. Okay, and the next mistake is when people are trying to do this kind of shimmy only with one leg in the front instead of working simultaneously with both of their knees and thighs. The next mistake is when people are trying to sit too much down while making this traveling movement. The next mistake is when people are lifting their heels up while making this traveling with shimmy. And the last mistake in this movement is when people are sitting down and they are trying to push their hips too much to the side. My dears, let's continue. We go on, and the next movement, which I'm going to explain to you about, is Hagala number 1. And the first mistake in this movement is when people are trying to do it with straight legs. The next mistake is when people are not dividing their body into two parts and they don't separate their joints and they are not helping with their knees to do a clear Hagala movement. The next mistake is when people are not contracting their hip muscle to make the movement very clear. The next very, very rude mistake is when people are not lifting their hip up and they are only doing it to the sides. We go on, and the next one is when people are sitting too much down. And the next mistake is when people are lifting their feet and their knees too much up. And the last mistake in this movement is when people are opening their thighs too much. My dears, let's go on to the next movement, and it's going to be arch with accent with traveling back. And mistake number one is when people are trying to do this movement again with straight legs. The next mistake is when people are not making their hip twist while doing the arch. The next very, very important mistake is when people are not dividing their body into two parts and they don't separate their right joint from their left joint, and that's why they are working with both hips together instead of working just with one joint and one hip. The next mistake is when people are sitting down too much, and that's why their head starts jumping. And the last mistake in this hip movement is when people are not working with their inner muscles from each of the side, and that's why their movement doesn't look clear and juicy. And the next movement is going to be the last for this class, and it's going to be the arch with accent and with traveling to the sides. And mistake number one in this movement is going to be when people are trying to make this movement again with straight legs. The next mistake is when people are working with both of their hips instead of working just with one joint and one hip. The next very important mistake is when people are not pushing their knee to the back to help this movement, and they are not contracting their hip muscle to make this hip movement very clear. And the last mistake in this hip movement is when people are not twisting their hips enough to show this movement in a clear way. Okay guys, we have finished with mistakes for today, and this is just the first class about the mistakes in hip movements. So if you want to check yourself if you are doing the other movements correctly or not, you can go and watch my second and my third class about mistakes in Egyptian hip technique. See you in my next educational videos.